Well, you're the bubble expert, so you kind of called the housing bubble with the Panderer to Power in it, talking about Alan Greenspan's play into that. Do you feel like Europe obviously looking like a bubble right now, but does that create our markets to become a whole separate bubble just because we rose so much on the prospective rebound of our economy, not banking on Europe happening like that? So I guess the question is, Europe is a bubble, yes? And are we now a new bubble?
Yeah, and there are, these are bubbles, artificial prices, and I think the way in which we're really connected to Europe is the banking system. We saw in 2007, 2008, how there was a problem in European banks that sort of flowed over when our banks had so much trouble, and we're probably it's moving in the opposite direction this time. The bailout of Greece was not so much a bailout of Greece; it was a bailout of German and French banks. And they had to bail out the German and French banks once they saw that the same problem that had happened here 2 years before. Banks weren't lending to each other. They had stopped lending because they were afraid of the solvency of the banks, and that's what happened in Europe, and I think we're going to see that continue to happen.
Is $1 trillion enough to set aside to bail out Europe? That's what they have on the sidelines right now. I say no. I say it's going to explode into something far worse, but please tell me otherwise.
Yeah. I think what we saw is that it's kind of interesting just to go back a little bit before that, because the week before they came up with the trillion, they came up with about 110 billion, and that was supposed to be the solution. But then within a couple of days, I think it was the German economic minister said that, why he said it, I don't know, that this is not going to cover Greece's financial requirements. And then the European credit default swaps just blew open. And then that weekend, they had one of those panic meetings that we got so used to with Hank Paulson back a couple of years ago. And that's when they came up with $1 trillion. But then just a couple of days after that, the German finance minister was saying that he thought the markets were out of control, which to me meant, first of all, you have to be careful if you're in the markets, but also that $1 trillion was not nearly enough if they couldn't, if they were so worried about the markets overwhelming this $1 trillion solution.
Okay, so who do you worry about falling next of the pigs? That is Portugal, Ireland, and Greece obviously has already taken a tumble, Italy and Spain.
I think it depends on which the next is which banks are really exposed. They're scared to death of failing banks, the banks going under that require constant funding from other banks, which means it's probably Spain.
Okay.
Ireland, in a way, is independent of that, but it probably has the largest exposure because the government has taken on so much. I think 50% of the GDP this year, I could be wrong, might have been 30%, but I think it was 50% of the GDP this year went to bailing out banks. That would be as if half of our GDP went to bailing out our banks, and despite our bailout, it was nowhere near that.
Okay, and what indicators are you looking for some stabilization?
I think that for stabilization, it would be that the banks were the interbank lending rates were stable and low. The LIBOR rate was low, and that there was not the volatility between the in some of these markets right now. I don't expect that. I think that this is building, and that it's going to boil over into something much bigger in the coming weeks.
What? So you think that the markets haven't even begun to come down? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that they have not. Yeah, I mean, the European markets really have not reflected the trouble that a lot of the economies are in, and the bond yields are still much too low. I think that it's as much as people are aware now that there are problems, the markets are not reflecting the troubles.
Okay, so over the next 3 to 5 months, for people who do follow the stock market, what do you expect? I know you're not into predicting necessarily numbers, but if you could just give a range, you expect, say, another 1,000 points to drop, especially since it's the summertime?
Well, yes, certainly. When the market dropped, 1,000 points a couple of weeks ago, I think it showed how vulnerable we are now to different trading systems that. We didn't have that vulnerability. I won't say we didn't have it before, but at least we clearly saw it. The Financial Times had an article recently that now only 3% of trading in stock exchange in the United States is retail trading. 97% is now institutional trading.
Which is an awful lot. That's basically the banks just calling the shots. But
yes.
If they're scared and if they foresee problems in Europe, they're going to get out, and it's just going to be an ugly, vicious cycle. And eventually the lousy 3% of the retail would jump on board too, right?
Yeah. Greece was, if you were to look at, say, ratios of what is debt to GDP, European versus the United States, Europe as a whole would look better than the United States.
I know, but that's because they have rules about that. The United States doesn't have any rules about that, and we should have probably established them like Europe. I mean, that is one thing I do admire Europe for, at least saying, hey, you can't belong to the EU unless you keep your numbers at this level. Can I ask you a strange question, Fred? If, say, everybody around the globe, Asia, Europe, the States, South America, if we all rung up our debt because we all got into some kind of trouble or another, would we ever get to a point where we would just write off each other's debt, or does that just not work because of inflation?
If we did, that causes a whole set of other problems.
The inflation.
Because, that leaves a whole host of insolvencies that would contribute to a debt economy. So it's very difficult. All of these sorts of solutions that seem as though they might work, they cause a lot of other problems. Once you have too much debt, it's almost impossible to get back to a stable situation again.
So the only thing to do is just cut costs and cut them fast, right?
Cut costs and cut fast, but again, that causes a lot of problems. For instance, one of the Greek solutions is, at least stated, that they're changing the retirement age for pensions for the state from 52 to 67. Okay, they do that, but then there are a lot of the economy then that depended on those 52 to 67-year-olds to spend that, then that part of the economy goes dead.
All right. So what's your bottom line solution? We got to get going, Fred.
The bottom line really is that the Europeans are still involved in a lot of double talk. They're saying one thing one day, they'll say the opposite thing the next day, and until they are able to
find their grounding.
Yeah, until they're believable, I think that the euro will be under tremendous pressure, and that there is the real probability that it's going to spill over into the United States.
Okay, thank you so much, Fred. We've got a little bit of bad news from you, but hopefully next time you come back on The Political Chick, we'll be talking about how we see some stabilization in the markets. Thank you again. Fred is the author of Panderer to Power. And Fred, what's the website people can go to find you?
aucontrarian.com.
Oh, contraire. All right. Thanks so much, Fred. We'll be right back on the other side of this break of The Political Chick, and we're going to talk to the Director of Living in Emergency, Mark Hopkins. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.
This is Chat About It, the future of Internet radio. Don't just listen to Internet.